Welcome everybody. Many of you know that normally I would welcome you in Maarsen at our venue, and many of you know it very well. It's close to the lake, so you have to picture the lake, the sun, and afterwards the beer and the barbecue. I hope you took care of your grocery shopping, so you have some beer in the fridge afterwards this time. So it's one of the advantages of a webinar is that you can't stick to the bar while we are running sessions. And one of the disadvantages is obviously we have many control about the technique, but not everything is in control. So we hope that everybody's connection will be perfect and that we have a very nice webinar. So welcome at this seminar about biotech during the pandemic. I hope you are all well, and that also is the case for your loved ones. I think we had a very special time the last months. We spent many hours at home. I'm glad that I'm at the office now together with some of my wonderful colleagues, and I really miss the interactions with all the people in the biotech community. So I really hope we can meet face to face again very soon. Furthermore, I think this pandemic really shows that biotech is such an important sector and so relevant, because the solutions to overcome this pandemic has to come from our sector. So given that, I think how to survive in these times and how to finance your company is a very interesting topic, and that's what we are going to talk about this afternoon. Our host, Daniel de Boer, as CEO of Procure, will be moderating this session. So Daniel, welcome, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Annemieke, and thank you also to the broader HollandBIO team for organizing this webinar. I hope everybody on the call is staying safe and is healthy and found ways to adapt to the new normal. Before we start with our conversation today, if any of the participants have questions throughout this panel, feel free to submit your questions through the chat function in Zoom, and if time allows, we will address your questions at the end of this session. I think this year so far has been a really interesting year for biopharma. In many different ways. We continue to see new innovation reaching patients in need at a completely unprecedented pace, helping patients that suffer from diseases that for a long time were deemed untreatable. And I think all this innovation and tangible impact to the lives of patients drives very meaningful value for our industry. Of course, the development of all these new innovations takes significant capital. And today we will talk about the financing climate of the biopharma and biotech companies in our sector. So as we all know, biotech is a very anti-cyclical industry from a capital markets perspective. We see in general that both private and public capital remains very available through crises. So for example, in the 2008 crisis, the financial crisis back then, the overall VC activity in, for example, the US, more than halved, but biotech financing throughout that entire period stayed stable. And I think that is the case now too. We see that on the private side, that after a bit of a slow start of the year, on the private side, biotech companies have skyrocketed. Within the US alone, there was $5.5 billion of new investments in privately held biotech companies in just the first quarter of this year. And on the public side, after an initial dip that we saw in March, when the Western world just started to go into lockdown, we saw an unprecedented influx of capital into new and also existing US public biotech companies of over 20 billion in just the last month and a half. So I think that shows that biotech financing in general remains fairly stable throughout these situations. I look forward to discuss the state of this biopharma world with our panel today, and therefore it's my pleasure to introduce to you the panelists of today's webinar. I think we have a great mix of both investors from the public and private sides, and an entrepreneur and an investor that both raised capital during the pandemic. So today are with us Geraldine O'Keefe, who's partner at venture capital firm LSP on the public side, Krijn de Noot, Chief Executive Officer of Meatable, which is a company that is developing animal-free meat, who just raised a financing round during the pandemic. Jan de Kerpel is also joining. Jan is Managing Director, Corporate Finance, Life Science and Healthcare at Kempen & Co., who can share a perspective on the public equity capital markets with respect to this situation. And Arthur Franken, who's partner at Gilde Healthcare, a venture capital firm, who raised a new fund of $450 million during the lockdown. So welcome, everyone. To kick it off today, I would like to start with one of the questions with one question to the entire panel. So you all run fairly different organizations, early startup, private public investors, investment bank. For your organizations individually, can you describe what the risks are that COVID-19 brings to your organization and how you manage those? And I would like to ask Geraldine to start.
Sure, thanks Daniel, and hello to everybody. First of all, congratulations to HollandBIO for managing to get anybody to log into this on a sunny Friday afternoon in Amsterdam. It has been an extraordinary few months. I think we'll all agree on that. And I suppose from LSP perspective, there are two main sides to our business. There is the private investment franchise and the public equity franchise. And on the private investment side, we were fortunate enough to close LSP 6 just before the pandemic hit. So in a sense, that puts us in a very good position, and also in terms of being able to support our portfolio companies. You know, we have good capital reserves, which in times like this and for private companies is the most important factor. For private companies, they can just get on with their business really, and even if there is some slight delays to their clinical trials, it's really about having the cash reserves to be able to weather that storm. On the public market side, it's a very different dynamic because any impact is immediate. You see it in the share price, you know, and it's dramatic. And investors see that and they get nervous. So you have to do a little bit more of hand-holding or a discussion with investors, trying to, make them realize that the fundamentals in these companies haven't changed. And I think we were all really, surprised at the dip and surprised at the recovery. I think I wrote it down here that from mid-February to mid-March, the XBI fell 30%. It was dramatic. It was a bloodbath. It was the worst month's performance in at least 10 years, probably even longer. But then from mid-March to now, we've gone up 60%. So that was kind of unprecedented. So I think there's a bit of head scratching going on in the public markets as well a bit at the moment. Nobody expected the dip to be so dramatic. Nobody expected the recovery to be so swift. So I think that also shows maybe to the resilience of the biotech market as well. I think maybe we are now being seen as maybe part of the solution and not just the problem. And there is certainly a positive that we are seeing is that there seems to be heightened interest in the healthcare sector and a heightened awareness of how critical it is for everybody. So maybe I'll stop there. I'm sure we'll have more questions later.
Yeah, absolutely. Arthur, would you like to comment to this?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Daniel. Hello, everyone. For Gilde, it was definitely a strange period. We already were in the midst of fundraising, and a lot of things happened towards the last chapter of our fundraising. We had a lot of exposure. We still have a lot of exposure to publicly listed companies via IPOs we did out of our private portfolio. So there you are immediately witnessing the value impact, and you have to report that to both your existing LPs as well as future prospects for our new fund. So there was definitely a very steep dip there. I think in total we're managing 1.5 billion assets under management, and we had probably more than 300 million in public equity, which took a serious nosedive. But the rebouncing effect of that and the timing of that was a bit unfortunate, but definitely we're back into very safe territory now. With respect to the private portfolio, that's more relevant for us as hands-on manager of our private holdings, and there immediately all boards came together and all board meetings were organized, immediately assessing the impact, immediate impact, looking at the future, risk profiling, risk assessment. And within Gilde, we did that really at a Gilde broad level. We implemented new meetings within Gilde to monitor the most companies at highest risk. So that exercise is still ongoing. We revised investment cases, reallocated reserves. We also saw that companies that were fundraising were facing an attrition rate in investors because they were doing the same and keeping more dry powder for their existing portfolios. So a lot of hands-on management. I think that period took like 6 weeks or so, and now we're in stable zone again. Our deal flow also was enriched with COVID-like opportunities from diagnostics, medtech, vaccines. So we had to make up our mind, what do we do with all that new deal flow as well? In the beginning, super distractive, super interesting. We had 2 out of the, I think, top 5 vaccines in our deal flow. Eventually, we didn't do anything yet, but nevertheless, very turbulent times. And of course, for our workers as well, we're in a business where we travel a lot, but I think that applies to all of you. We found our way to manage our workflow, but we are definitely missing the new networking and the in-person contacts with the community out there. So looking forward to that again.
Yeah, maybe to jump to Krijn, because Krijn, you were able to raise capital during this lockdown situation. Maybe you can comment a little bit how COVID-19 played into that situation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's sort of also sort of linking it back to your earlier question. I think in the end, it's all about really reassessing what as management you give attention, right? That's sort of, I think, and you have to redefine that very rigorously. And I think that's also what we did indeed. So I was sort of reflecting on it because I knew, Daniel, that you're going to ask this question. So I was reflecting on it, and in the end, I think the process is still the same, right? But you just have to weigh things a little bit different. So in the end, it starts with recognizing the uncertainty and saying, well, we don't know how the future is going to look, but it's the right decision to focus management attention, and in this case, my attention more on reaching out to investors. So I think that was sort of the first conscious decision to make. And then secondly, it's what I think we did well is look for sort of the granularity in the investor space, because overall it dried up, but then you need to look for the subset of investors where that's actually not the case. So we're a little bit more into sort of the generalist venture capital space, but then funds that are at the end of their runway, which have a big B2B software as a service portfolio, probably are not the right people to talk to because they have their own portfolio companies are in big trouble, right? So that's one thing that we steered away from. So sort of new funds with not a huge existing portfolio. In our case, also recognizing where we are as a company, very much research phase, so sort of scientifically focused investors, and then the right mandate. And in this case, it was sort of cellular agriculture, as they call it, the space. So I think it was really finding what's the niche where actually the market didn't dry up, right? And that's what you then focus on. And then secondly, I think using the storyline to your advantage, and there's a portion of luck, of course, in this, but for example, what you saw in the US is meat supply drying up because there were COVID outbreaks in the slaughterhouses. And so there was a clear storyline on, hey, actually, this pandemic shows that the relevance of what we're doing is even higher. So I think changing the storyline and the messaging. And then lastly, I think what really worked well for us is first syndicate with your current investor base and already get them to commit. And then it's always easier to get that new investor on board. So those were a couple of reflections I had on why I think we were able to raise the funds we did.
Hey, and Arthur just commented that it's difficult in this situation during a lockdown, given a limited travel, to make new connections, to reach out to new investors. How have you experienced that, given the in the process of fundraising, you want to meet a lot of different people?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I tested this yesterday. I was talking to somebody from sort of a boutique investment fund, because I also, so the feeling I had is sort of everything until sort of the smaller tickets until like 10 million, they will probably get done. But if you're really talking about the bigger tickets, that might be more difficult, because there you really sort of need to look each other in the eye, see sort of the company at work. But what he mentioned actually is that he saw 30, 50, 60 million deals being done over Zoom. So he said investors seem to be comfortable with even writing these big tickets, over the internet, basically. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. Absolutely. We'll come back to this. I think there's a lot of interesting parts to talk about. But before we do that, Jan, would you like to give your perspective?
Yeah, thank you, and also hi to everybody, and thank you to HollandBIO. So, yeah, working in an investment bank, you clearly don't have any labs to take care of, so that's a positive one for us. Everybody works on computers and virtual. The whole organization, 1,200 people, were from one week to the other put at home. And I'm still actually working from home, working from Belgium, that is in my case, and I've only been once in the Netherlands, and people were asking, are you allowed to travel? So that was the first thing. So what we do is on public market, Geraldine already mentioned some of that, and otherwise M&A. And when we went into the March timeframe, all of a sudden portfolio managers, just as Geraldine and her colleagues, had to reshuffle their portfolios, and not per se in life sciences, but really go into the macroeconomic cycle. So from that end, it remained very, very busy. But we were also working on equity capital markets deals, bringing companies to the stock market, IPO, doing fundraisings for publicly listed companies, and that immediately dropped dead. And I vividly remember that we had a discussion in the end of March, April, on an IPO trajectory that actually is going to list on Monday, a Belgian company called Hyloris. Should we continue or just not decide to go and bring it over the summer? And luckily we decided, let's continue with the trajectory, because the only thing that we have control over is our own destiny. We don't control the market, but if the market would come back, let's make sure we can jump. And luckily we made that decision. When it came to M&A, we were also working on some projects there, and still you saw that at the board level of the company that had to acquire the other company, there was immediately an enormous red flag talking about risk. These people understood that there would be no big gains, although it could be cheap, cheaper the asset that they would be buying, that there would no gains to be made to make excessive risks. So a lot of these projects immediately came to a halt, and you saw the M&A drying out. Definitely is coming back and will come back. Now on our business, I mentioned it, the virtual aspect. To come back on this IPO story, there's more than 50 million in the book. Not a single investor has seen real face-to-face the CEO or the management team. We did dozens and dozens of virtual meetings for the first time, like we are doing now. People make their investment decision based on these virtual interactions. It's really incredible. And you see that also in the US, it's super hot over there with IPOs. Normally, book building trajectories take 2 weeks, let's say. Now it's done in 4 or 5 days, because instead of traveling to New York and then the day after to Boston, or in Europe, one day in London, one day in Stockholm, you can now do a call in the morning at 9 a.m. in London, then at 10 a.m. in Paris with somebody, at 2 o'clock you're in New York. So it can all go much more condensed. So I truly believe that part of it will definitely stay. So yeah, in our business, a different way of working, but a lot of enthusiasm for life sciences, including COVID-19. We actually saw, everybody may remember that the US president thinking of buying a German company working on a vaccine. That was also something new that we saw. But I think we're coping very well with it, and the whole ecosystem is finding a new normal.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting perspective, Jan. I certainly agree with you that it would be great if some of the efficiencies that we gained through this, forced way of working from home and limited travel, if we can continue those when things go back to a little bit more normal. Because I think the level of efficiencies this brings for companies and people individually is so tremendous that it's really worthwhile to hold on to those. So for today's webinar, we have a few polls lined up as well to make this interactive with the participants. So I thought it would be interesting to see what the participants think of the following statement that was suggested by one of the panelists. And then after that, after everybody got a chance to vote, I would be interested to hear from the panelists how they think about this particular topic. I think one of the key topics of this conversation is financing, how we manage cash during this pandemic, both from a fund side as well as from a company side. How do you manage runway in a situation where access to capital is uncertain? So I would like to ask to bring up poll number 4, which is the statement. As a consequence of COVID-19, I have shifted clinical resources to preclinical research and development activities. So I'll give the participants a minute to put in their choice. While we do that, Geraldine, I would be very interested to hear from you how you guys go about balancing your portfolio, where how you balance between new and existing deals in the portfolio, and how you like to see your portfolio companies manage their cash runway.
Yeah, great question, Daniel. But just to highlight, of course, I'm speaking as a public market investor, which of course is Arthur, of course, can cover what they do on the private side. I suppose in the public markets, as I mentioned earlier, everything is a bit much more swift and transparent in terms of how the market reacts. So when I suppose the pandemic hit and the market started to crash, the first thing we were thinking of looking at our portfolio is their cash runway, because that's your immediate concern. Is does one of the portfolio companies need cash very soon? Because that could be a huge risk for that company. Then once you assess whether their cash runway is okay, then another question you would have is other inherent risks. As I'm sure you're all aware, in a bad market, companies tend to be overpunished for bad news. So then you are looking at upcoming catalysts in your portfolio and reassessing the risk associated with those catalysts. So if, for example, a company is anticipating phase 3 data and it's very high risk, then maybe you have a different perspective on how much of that stock you want to hold in the portfolio, just as a broad example. So that's always another thing. So cash and catalysts. And then in terms of existing and new investments, again, it's a little bit different because we're not in the same way responsible for our portfolio companies. And from my perspective then, as portfolio management, diversification is a better option. So adding new positions would, from my perspective, diversify my risk further. So that's what I was looking to do. So reposition within the existing portfolio in terms of their risk profile, and then looking to add new positions. And of course, the we can call it a positive about the pandemic is that it did throw up opportunities as an investor as well, because some of these companies did get overly punished, and it gives the opportunity to buy things at what we consider a sharper valuation. In terms of therapeutic areas you might go into, of course, then the immediate thing is, anti-infectives and vaccines were an area that I always shied away from, I have to say, because it was always a very difficult area to make any money as an investor, whereas suddenly every company that had anything that could be remotely connected with COVID was getting, you know, huge valuations. And then you have to, as an investor, decide, do I want to play in that or not? And that's a difficult one because, you know, there's certain companies that I've been following for years that never got anywhere with their technology now have suddenly got market valuations of several billion, you know. So for us as fundamental investors, we've kind of stayed away from that, rightly or wrongly.
Right.
We just decided, as someone in the panel said earlier, we can't control everything. We just have to stick to what we can do and look at the fundamental valuation and the fundamental science and make our decision based on that. So for now, at least, we haven't been investing specifically in companies that have treatments for coronavirus or vaccines, although some of the companies in our portfolio are working on that line, but it's not the core part of our investment. Hope that helps.
Thanks. So, Arthur, I can imagine that from the private side, that is a very different dynamic. How you look at your companies, where to put your next investment, how to balance that with new opportunities versus existing portfolio companies. Can you comment a bit how you guys at Gilde think about this?
Yeah, exactly. We were, of course, in a strange situation, being between two schools, right? Between Fund 4 and Fund 5. So we were already looking to do the last two investments of Fund 4. Now that's always very laser sharp focus. How should that investment look like? And then COVID broke out, and then we decided to make only one new investment of Fund 4. That one has been announced. It's in the mental health space. So basically that enables us to have bigger reserves for Fund 4, and that's a result of our risk assessment. Now, so Fund 4 now has more reserves due to COVID for our private investments. Fortunately, in Fund 4, we were also able to do two follow-on investments, one private investment and one mega IPO that actually was pulled during the COVID and then was refiled and completed and 23 times oversubscribed during the COVID. So it completed. And then in other funds, unfortunately, we had to, cut costs severely. Like 2 board meetings spent on that topic, started with mandated paid time off, furloughs, leaves, and then eventually also reduction in force. So at Gilde, we have a very diversified portfolio. We do a lot of biotech, where we actively manage clinical development, of course, and ongoing clinical studies. But we also have commercial stage companies where, we're looking at the impact of revenues, and also do a bit in digital health. We will come to that later. But so it was very diverse. There were lots of moments to celebrate for us, but also a lot of crisis moments. For Fund 5 now, with $450 million, the investment period doesn't change. We still have 5 years to deploy this, and God knows how long COVID will take. We will deploy this money. So we're working very hard to deploy this money in new investments. And in fact, we already have done one that will be announced soon.
Great, thanks. Oh, hey, and Krijn, you and Meetable closed the financing, I think last week or the week before that, during the pandemic. In that situation, how did your conversations with investors go about managing the cash runway during this pandemic, and the projections for access to capital for the company?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think also those conversations were different 2 months ago, I think, definitely, than they are now. I think there's a big, so much risks or perceived risk seems to be out, right? So I think that's one clear point. I think we don't have sort of this preclinical split, but I think if you would compare it, we are preclinical, right? It's really, we're in the sort of value creation research mode. So I think across the board with our current investors and also with the new investors, it was very clear that the last thing you should do is stand on the brakes. So this is really your value creation phase. anyway, you know, if you have a biotech company, you will have to fund through at least one recession, right? So I think in general you need to be cautious about it. But definitely in this phase, they said don't step on the brake. If anything, put some extra gas on it. And I think one thing we saw, if at some point there is sort of a bigger supply of talent, because other companies are not doing that well, then we definitely discussed ramping up. I haven't really seen that yet, but I can imagine if such a thing would happen closer to September or October, also when some of the government support reduces, I think that would even be a reason to put a little bit more gas on the pedal.
Hey, and Jan, I think Geraldine at the beginning of this webinar already describes the madness of the public markets, the MBI and the XBI completely collapsing and then skyrocketing up soon thereafter. Can you talk a little bit about the sentiment in the markets and how public investors see cash runway and cash management at companies and diversification at their portfolios?
Yeah, for many, and of course, Geraldine is the person here. For many life science specialist investors, it's very often business as usual, because many of the companies, it's all about cash runway, next value inflection point, and most companies know how to deal with these things. As just as a standard modus operandi, what COVID did bring new to that is delay in clinical trials. So, and that was a very important topic in the, I would say, in the March-April time frame, even for very deadly diseases. In oncology, people were even not able to go to the hospital anymore. Let's stand for more, I would say, moderate or less deadly diseases. People were just not seeing the doctor. So we quickly saw 1, 2, or more quarters of delay in the clinical studies, meaning also cash runways having to compensate for that, something that Krijn more or less alluded to. And that was a very important topic for the discussion with these companies. Do you have enough to weather that storm, and how are you mitigating that risk in itself? So immediately you saw actually two kind of waves: those who were able to cope with it, and companies that said, we have all our patients in, we're doing the data analysis, no impact, very clear message. And others who said, we have an impact, we don't know how to deal with it, pressure on the share price. That was a very strong topic. Nowadays, everybody knows how to deal with it and has resolved it. The other point is also that capital markets were not open to these quick deals that you normally see. And we saw also in the Netherlands, some companies that did the so-called club deals. 1 or 2 investors in public markets that came into the company and then took a sizable position because they could. I think Geraldine also alluded to it. Because of the lower share prices, she could take advantage of it. And we've seen that for sure. And this was very temporarily, and now we're moving back into the normal as we speak.
That's very interesting. Jan, maybe this is a nice segue. I know you prepared the slides to give some perspective on the broader capital markets. Maybe we can pull up that slide. And while we're doing that, the results of the poll were, I think, a bit inconclusive, given it was not relevant for the vast majority of the participants. So we'll probably leave it at that. So if we can pull up the slide that Jan prepared, then back to you, Jan.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. And indeed, what we've prepared is that you see for public markets, and so publicly listed companies like ProQR, for instance, if they have to capitalize, they either do it via an IPO or via follow-on transactions. So what you see here is for the first 6 months, January through June, for 2019 and 2020, the volume that was in the market, both in terms of deals. That's the little number in the square bracket, but also the different coloring for the IPOs in the light gray, and then blue for follow-on transactions. And what you saw was that up until March, more or less, it was January and February, business as usual. In March 2019, there was a huge ramp up because of some items that happened more from the regulatory time frame, but you saw a massive decline in March coming, 0 IPOs. You also saw that in April, and this is only for European life science companies, by the way, 0 IPOs in the April timeframe, while in 2019 there was a very nice volume of all kind of IPOs. And then the most remarkable is, after the big plummet in March, an enormous rebound in May. And life sciences companies have been particularly very active in this space. The only other type of companies that were able to go to the public markets were those who were offering services like Zoom or these kind of remote technologies to bring people together. And we broke actually records in the life sciences space, with Belgian-Dutch company called Argenix making the biggest raise ever for a European company, 880 million overnight. We've never seen that in Europe. In the US, we had Moderna, who was very well known for its COVID-19, amongst other vaccines, raised 1.4 billion. Incredible records were done. And going into June, and this is only part of June, we see that the trend continues to go very fast. So what we see is that generalist investors who would normally not be very keen in investing in companies that are loss-making or development stage, all of a sudden want to have this exposure to this vaccine, diagnostics, and infectious disease items. That's a very remarkable trend that we've seen. So that's a bit in a nutshell what this statistic tries to show.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you, Jan. I think the peak in May is remarkable. Is that mostly driven by generalist capital flowing into the markets, or is there other reasons for that as well?
Yeah, it's definitely not only generalists, so let that be clear. First of all, there's all these projects, all these companies who have been piling up their capital needs that normally should have come to the market in March and April, of course, came and jumped through the window in May. That's the first thing. The second thing is that specialist healthcare investors saw that there is opportunity. So I would say more business as usual type of investors, but also generalist long-only investors who had to rebalance their portfolio due to what was going on in the world, had to have more exposure to these kind of companies. And I don't know, but Geraldine definitely may jump in here, wanted to have exposure to the total COVID-19 healthcare team. And then if you look at big pharma companies like Johnson & Johnson, GSK, Pfizer, what do you have, who were moving into the vaccine, into the therapeutic space, were also drawing a lot of attention. And then finally, something that is not always very well known, in the March-April timeframe, hedge funds also had completely put themselves at zero risk, but they often need to have deals coming into the market to do their little trick. They are momentum players. And so you saw that they were underperforming, and because there were no deals, they also moved much more strongly into the deal making that came into May. So it's definitely a lot of different teams that played over there. And we do expect that this will continue in June and probably in the July timeframe going forward.
Thanks, Jan. Yeah, and indeed, Geraldine, is there anything you'd like to add to this as portfolio manager in the public space?
Yeah, I think Jan put it very nicely there. I think there was a bit of a snowball effect. I suppose if you're looking at IPOs and follow-on offerings, those are marketed to qualified investors. So that's not generalist money. But on top of what Jan is showing here, for follow-ons and IPOs, which is also mirroring what happened in the US, there's also completely fall off in March, and then a huge surge in April, May, and June as well in terms of offerings and IPOs. But I think the generalist investors coming into the sector has also had a huge impact. I mean, we've seen huge moves in the pharma companies, pharma companies going up 20, 30%. I mean, that's unheard of. These are huge companies, and that's an enormous amount of value added to those companies. And that can only happen if there is both the hedge funds, the generalist investors, the professional investors, and a huge excitement in a way around the possibility that these companies could do something for Corona. and create a vaccine. And I mean, you can't open any media outlet without hearing about the latest about the corona vaccine. I mean, even my mother knows more about corona vaccines and drug development than ever before. Everybody's talking about it, but everybody's trying to get into it. It does make me a little worried though, because it can get a little bit frothy in terms of if they won't all be successful. There will be some major blow-ups, and I would just be a bit nervous about how that can change the sentiment further down the road.
Yeah, no, I think you're right there. The rise that we're seeing can probably not continue, and is maybe driven on additional attention for our industry, which is great because I think we have been underappreciated. But I agree that
now, you know, that's the
yeah,
thing.
exactly.
We just this is what we've always wanted. We've always wanted more generalist sentiment in the sector, more of a positive view on the sector, which has come now.
Yeah.
We just kind of hope that there aren't any big blow-ups that are going to disappoint, and it could take us a long time to recover from that blow.
Yeah, yeah. So really interesting to hear what's happening in the public markets. Private markets obviously fairly different. Arthur, you guys were able to raise a fund, which I think is the biggest fund for Gilde so far, 450 million, during the lockdown. Can you talk to us a little bit about that experience and how the lockdown situation played into that?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a very turbulent time, and we were just 2 months into the fundraising, official fundraising. So it was going very fast, and there was a lot of demand. Our target was 350, and our hard cap was actually 400, and then I'm talking about euros, million euros. The preparation was, of course, already done in Q3, Q4 2019, the in-house preparation, and that was done extremely well. We had the house in good shape. The portfolio was performing extremely well up until that point, so that really nicely came up to the pitch at the timing of the pitch. But then really in January, we were starting first conversations, and before we knew it, we were in the second half of February with the second meetings. And we fortunately put all the on-site due diligence meetings with all the LPs in the first half of February, and we finished them in end of February. So in March, we had done the lion's share of the in-person meetings. But there were lots of follow-on questions. And then suddenly we were hit with this lockdown. And, you know, fortunately we had a large group of professional LPs, but all of them, you know, were looking at their liquidity, solvability, and their reserves. None of them really declined based on their reaction to COVID. There were some family offices that we historically have in our fund that had some more challenges in terms of their initial commitments to our fund, but we were so well prepared. And then it comes down to once you're prepared and once you're in touch, and I think that's interesting for the audience that are in the process of fundraising, stick to your process, stick to your timelines, keep your interested shareholders engaged. So really that engagement, use all the digital tools we have to engage them. And that enables you to sense when they're distracted, because definitely this was a period of huge distraction for many people, and they had to reinvent, reshuffle their workflow. So drag them to your proposition, keep them interested, and then keep new news coming in. And we also started the COVID-19 reporting of our existing portfolio, and the positives and the negatives, full transparency. And then we basically opened it up for reconsideration, saying we all are aware of the situation out there. Please reconfirm your commitments. No, you know, no problems if you deviate from it. But we really gave them the opportunity to rethink their initial commitments. So that I think also indirectly came through as a sign of strength. Yeah. What investors with hindsight emphasized once we were closed is basically saying we like two things. That is healthcare in general, as a sector, resilience and the awareness and the impact it has definitely in times like this. What we also like about your flagship fund, Gilda's Healthcare 5, is that you are pursuing dynamic allocation, early to late stage biotech, early to late stage medtech, early to late stage digital health in Europe and in the US. So, and that is something we've done since Gilda Healthcare exists for 2 decades now. And that enables us to balance a bit where we see the best opportunities. So yes, it was exciting, but it sounds stupid, but it almost looked like we were prepared for it. Of course, we didn't see it going.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That must have been quite an experience to complete that in these unprecedented times. There's a few questions that came in from the audience, and one I think if we combine a few, one question that keeps rising to the surface is that I think we all feel a big need to contribute to a solution to this pandemic. I think it has been an unprecedented impact on global societies and economies. And I think a lot of people also here around the table feel the need, the obligation to help there. I think we've seen that many companies, probably a few hundred so far, have medicines and vaccines under development in early stage, late stage, maybe even a few repurposing products that could be registered for COVID-19. I would be interested to hear from the panelists around the table to what extent you feel that our industry should focus more on antivirals, on COVID-19 focused products. So maybe if I could start with Jan on that topic.
Let me unmute, yeah. I think our industry actually focuses a lot on antivirals and antibacterial and what do you have. It's just that funding and the public healthcare system has not always been able to attribute sufficient return on investment for that. So for instance, in the diagnostic space, which is super important in this COVID-19 period, Corona period, it's all about as cheap as possible and as quick as possible. Now we understand when we look at the television with these disastrous situations in the hospital that if you don't know what a patient has, you cannot start with treatment. So diagnostics in a fast and reliable way should be worth something. It's not the cheapest here. On vaccines, the same thing. Vaccines, it cannot be as cheap as possible because we don't know when we become ill because we're vaccinated, so we actually don't realize it's so important. So I think these kind of things, and I'm really thinking of the big macroeconomical decision-making areas, governments, WHO, what do you have? They more realize now that this is where funding and resources should go for next generation technologies. If that is there, for sure investors will follow it because the return on investment will be there. Secondly, I think the things that the large companies in our industry have done, and really thinking of the J&Js of this world and what do you have, they have shown guts by going into the system and saying we are going to prepare stuff in the lab and immediately put a lot of resources into the manufacturing and the logistics of it without knowing if it will be approved or not. That has, I think, contributed a lot to the credibility of our industry and to the awareness that people at home, Geraldine's grandmother by means of speaking, realize that it's a little bit more complex than just a populistic discussion on the price of a drug for a patient. So that's a bit the view that how I'm looking at it.
Thanks, Jan. Hey, Geraldine, what's your perspective on the focus of our industry right now on COVID-19 and how balanced that is?
Well, to echo what Jan said, I'm actually quite proud of the way the industry has responded to this. I think we have seen an unprecedented level of collaboration. We have seen, big pharmas collaborating like never before. They have been opening up their freezers in a virtual way to researchers to dig in and find anything that could help with coronavirus. And I think that has also fed into the public perception of the sector and why it's being viewed more positively now. There are at this point something like 200 vaccines in development, and several hundred drugs are being tested against coronavirus. This changes everything, I think, for anti-infectives and diagnostics, as Jan was saying, because they've always been underappreciated, undervalued, and from an investor perspective, difficult investments, because diagnostics were always seen as a cost center. So there never seemed to be a willingness on the part of insurers to pay anything other than a cheap price for a diagnostic, whereas there was a disconnect in terms of if you have a good diagnostic, then you give the right drug and overall cost benefit for everybody. And I'm hoping that what we're seeing now and the huge drive for new diagnostic tests will also continue and be, filtered to other areas of science. And in terms of the vaccine development as well, that's an area that's been underappreciated. I'm hoping that this is going to change everybody's perspective on and perception of investment and development of new drugs and vaccines.
Yeah, no, I think we're all hopeful and proud of our industry that we will contribute to the solution for this. I think another thing we noticed during this window is that under all this pressure, the regulatory pathways and the acceleration there of the way how regulators are willing to think and look at these urgent projects, I think have been remarkable and can potentially hold frameworks that for the future, when things do go back to normal, can be applied to other therapeutic areas, which I think would be a really important aspect in our industry. I know we are coming up towards the end of our session, so I'm going to ask each panelist to maybe give in 1 or 2 minutes a few tips and tricks and advices to some of the participants on the call today that are thinking about raising money, thinking about managing their company through this pandemic, thinking about how this should affect their strategy as a company, given there is a lot of uncertainty with access to capital, etc. And mixing in one of the questions that we received through the chat function is how to think about this geographically. So should companies that are thinking about their financing plans and their corporate financing strategy right now think about different regions to raise their capital from? Is there more available in the US, in Europe, or other areas? So maybe I can start with Arthur.
Yeah, I would definitely not go to the US. There's lots of capital available in Europe and in the Benelux. LSP has a huge fund. Gilde just raised a fund. Forbion has a huge fund. They will announce another fund next week. Biogeneration this week announced a 105 million fund. So I think that for all kind of companies, there's so much money. And what I've seen over the last 5 years is a lot of US interest in European companies, but in the last year, I've seen that reducing a bit. So I think answered this question on the chat as well, typed it. If you want to go to the US, you might engage with a smart advisor helping you. You might just come to Gilde or to another VC with ties, US investors, we always syndicate, or you go to an entrepreneur in residence of one of the venture creators there in the US, but then you probably lose your control over your innovation and they run away with it. So yeah, there's enough of funding available here. What to do now in the COVID time, managing your cash runway. Definitely I would keep your overhead as low as possible, because inevitably everyone is encountering delay. I've seen that CROs are dumping their losses onto their clients already, first signs of that clinical research organization. So I think the real impact will be visible still in the ongoing 6 months from now. Be open to attract, be always in fundraising mode during times like this. So there's never a round fully closed. So keep on focusing on fundraising.
Good, thank you for that, and good to see you're not biased whatsoever towards the European aspect of things. Krijn, you coming hot off the press with your financing. How have you thought about any tips and tricks for people that are in that process now?
Yeah, I think I largely echo some of the things that Arthur said. So I think indeed it never ends, right? And always sort of be fundraising and always have those conversations so that the relationships are built and it's not sort of a cold call. So I think that's just to keep those conversations going. And I strongly believe that if you have a sound company and you're able to show that you are promising that you're doing the things that you promise, that there will be funds available. I think for me as an as an entrepreneur, I do see it as a global market, very much so. I think also sort of the healthcare biotech is different. I think in Europe that's very well developed. If you look at sort of the more generalist venture capital funding, like raising 40-50 million is just less common, and I think that's what we need. So definitely we are eyeing sort of Asia and US as well. And then I think it's all the total package, right? Obviously, in an ideal world, you would want to have your investors close by because it's a huge advantage. Culturally, it has a huge advantage, but it's all it has to add up. And I think the last one is sort of in terms of how you manage is being deliberate on where you are as a company and in which stage you are, if you are in value generation or in value capture. I think that's being very deliberate on that. I think that will then drive your strategy and your funding strategy essentially.
Great, thank you, Krijn. Geraldine, as any final comments after that? I think we need to wrap up.
Okay, now I think, thanks Arthur. I think I hear the phone ringing already with investors calling in. I would also say maybe as a last comment is for companies to think big. There is never a perfect market. This is a volatile sector anyway. There certainly seems to be a lot of money out there and available, and investors seem to be very keen to invest in this sector. So for any company out there thinking of raising, I would say, get out there. And also in terms of reaching out to investors, it does seem to be more accessible. People do seem to be more accessible now via Zoom, and it seems to be easier to get meetings. So that was my final comment.
Thank you. Jan, anything to close up with from your end?
Yeah, thank you. A couple of points from my end. There will always be a crisis. Every 5 to 10 years, there is a crisis. So rest assured it will be there. Second, think 2-3 funding rounds ahead. Not the next one, but the one thereafter. And that brings us to create optionality. Create options that you can choose from, and whatever the environment or your company needs, you can pick at that moment in time the best thing. There is not a single plan as a third point. And then finally, I echo a little bit what Arthur says. There is really a lot of money available, smart money available in Europe. But it also means you have to choose the investor that is good for your company at that moment in time. At a certain moment in time, it can be seed money. At a certain moment in time, it can be Hilde Healthcare, but or LSP. But at a certain moment in time, if you need 200 million euros or dollars, you won't be able to find that with a VC anymore. Then you need to go to the next step, to the public market. So that's a little bit my message here. Choose the investor that fits your company.
Great, thank you, Jan. With that, we're at the end of our session. Unfortunately, we did not get through all the questions from the participants, but I hope we were able to answer the lion's share of those. This webinar was recorded, so if you missed part of it or want to show to others, you can find it afterwards on the website of HollandBIO. With that, I want to thank the panelists, Geraldine, Krijn, Jan, Arthur. Thank you for your participation and insights that you provided on this panel. And I also want to thank HollandBIO for organizing this. And with that, I want to wish everyone a great weekend.